This documentary will explore the liberal, progressive tradition in the South. This presentation was completed for the Summer 2020 Sociology of the South Master's Level course at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. The following individuals contributed to this documentary: Emily Cleveland, Tatiana Cookingham, and Morgan Froelich. Historically, the American South is a unique political anomaly that has been, in many ways, outside of the larger scope of American politics. The region's history, geography, traditions, and cultural evolution have all contributed to its unique political landscape. There have been many kinds of progressives in the South. Some would argue that the origins of Southern progressivism were born out of a populist revolt in the region, while revisionists say that reforms in the 20th century were due to a maturity away from traditional politics held in the region. Others credit Northern progressivism's influence on its liberal neighbors to the South. Between 1867 and 1869, several interracial meetings were held in Charleston, South Carolina, with plans to redraft the state's constitution. This created a short-lived interracial democracy, with African Americans occupying a quarter of the seats in the conventions. These conventions drafted constitutions reflecting progressive issues of the mostly Republican delegates. New constitutions guaranteed Black men the right to vote, all before the 15th Amendment in 1870. Democrats, on the other hand, were committed to their racist platforms, and by 1877, Democrats and their allies, the Ku Klux Klan, used intimidation and violence to drive Republicans out and return white conservatives to power. Person of interest: Joseph Rainey. Rainey was the first African American to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, the first African American to preside over the House, and the longest-serving African American during the tumultuous Reconstruction period. He advocated for his constituents, both Black and white. By 1900, the South entered an era of social change that included railroad regulation, prison reformation, women's rights, and even some timid steps toward improving race relations. By 1911, President Woodrow Wilson took over as the leader of the Progressive Democrats. Liberal Southerners quickly joined Wilson because his new freedom philosophy and program had a powerful appeal to certain Southern groups. By 1912, there was a far-reaching progressive movement in the South. The Granger movement was an attempt by farmers to strike back at the industrial and railroad giants oppressing them. There was also the Greenback labor movement, which insisted on adequate educational facilities and an equalization of the tax burden. When efforts to liberalize the Democratic Party failed, Southern farmers joined farmers in the West and launched the People's Party. In late 1938, the Southern Conference for Human Welfare brought together an interracial crowd of progressive politicians, Southern liberals, and labor leaders. They responded to the findings of the Roosevelt administration's report on the economic conditions of the South, which described the region as the nation's #1 economic problem at the time. The term liberal or progressive has meant and adapted too many different meanings throughout Southern history, especially during the time period between post-World War II and the Civil Rights Movement. Here are a few terms to describe the liberal or progressive movement during the era. One Nation progressive conservatism describes the tension between those prepared to embrace more progressive views and those who are not yet ready to accept change. Progressivism was viewed as a philosophical ideology that sought innovation for politics, economics, and social justice issues to better society. It was mostly liberal, but maintained some fairly conservative traits as well. The status quo society are those that claim to be Southern liberals, but really aren't as liberal as they personally believe in respect to race, sex, and class. Southern progressives were not necessarily liberal, but moderate at best. They did not focus on tearing down social hierarchies or racial injustice, but rather aimed to create a more balanced society that could advance the region economically. The Democratic Party of the Southern House delegation was consistently over 90% from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. The South turned to a primarily Republican region when President Truman supported the Civil Rights Initiative and introduced his pro-civil rights platform in 1948, and a faction of Democrats separated from the party and became known as the Dixiecrats. After World War II, Southern white liberals were united by issues that specifically affected both whites and blacks in the region. Although this activism and practice from Southern liberals sounds beneficial for the South, there has been pushback about the history of this time being very controversial for the more progressive party. An interesting study was conducted on the characteristics of white Southern congressmen holding official positions from 1949 to 1964. Initially, it was determined that even those that identified as an advocate for civil rights only did so when it was in the best interest of their re-election. Further, it was not until the 1960s, when the Democratic Party took up the mantle of civil rights, that African Americans shifted their support for the party, and since 1968, no Republican presidential candidate has received more than 13% of the black vote. The three main theories of policy are institutional politics theory, political meditation theory of movement, and policy feedback theory. There are two significant movements that incited policy during this era, the Southern Conference for Human Welfare and the Southern Regional Council. Thanks to organizations and movements in this era, there are 5 significant liberal policies pictured here that have helped shape America. To Kill a Mockingbird demonstrates the friends and neighbors effect on liberal Southern politics, with the notion that voters are less likely to identify with candidates based on platform but rather geographical proximity. The American political tradition described and identified the rich historiographical heritage of the Southern progressive vision. One significant topic the book focuses on is that in the 1950s, Americans who engaged in political thought and activism began to wonder if politics were as liberal as they believed or really a type of modern republicanism. Judge J. Wades Waring was a federal district judge in South Carolina from 1942 to 1952. He was part of the minority who publicly supported an end to segregation in order to pursue racial justice, and often seemed more passionate about the matter than even Northern liberals. A more well-known influential liberal politician of the area was Hubert Humphrey, who argued tirelessly for legislation addressing issues of civil rights and nuclear disarmament. By the end of the Civil Rights era, we see a transition to a second reconstruction in the liberal movement in the South, with a rebranding of the Democratic Party from conservative to liberal. The 1960 presidential election of John F. Kennedy Jr. took place during the height of the Civil Rights movement. As you can see, Southern states were mainly associated with the Democratic Party. A majority of the South continued to support the Democratic Party because it thought of the Republican Party as the party of Abraham Lincoln and Reconstruction. The big break didn't come until President Johnson, another Southern Democrat, who signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. After the enactment of these two acts, it was rumored that President Johnson said, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." Additionally, these two pieces of legislation shifted African American support to the Democratic Party. The nation's party's progressivism led Southern conservatives to bolt to the GOP, which appealed to white resentment over desegregation. Less than 10 years after Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, we see the transition of white Southerners away from the Democratic Party. In a complete shift, the election results for 1972 showed that all Southern states supported the election of the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon. By 1980, Ronald Reagan solidified the conservative Republican Party's hold on white Southerners by winning the Republican nomination and sweeping the South. He then wrestled the South away from Carter, who won only in his home state of Georgia. In 1992, Bill Clinton, a Southern Democrat, won the White House, and his unpopular views pushed the election of Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich, who was the first Republican Speaker of the House in 40 years. During this time, conservative Republicans also took the majority in the Senate and governorships. From 1994 on, the majority in all three categories would be conservative Republicans. 2008 brought the election of Barack Obama, the first non-Southern Democratic president since JFK. He did well in the South and nationally, mobilizing voters who were younger, women, Hispanic, and African American. As of 2014, 31% of white Southerners say they were Democrats or lean Democratic, and 77% of African Americans said they were Democrats or lean Democratic. Alabama's 2011 voter identification law reduced turnout in the most diverse counties. Despite this law, in 2018, the state's grassroots organizers targeted black voters to help elect liberal Democrat Doug Jones to the U.S. Senate. By the end of the 20th century, the term Solid South had been redefined with the Republican Party, conservatism's new standard-bearer, holding sway across the region. As of 2011, Republicans controlled 81% of statewide offices in the South. In the 2016 presidential election, every Southern state but Virginia backed Donald Trump, suggesting that conservatism's tenacious grip on the region would not soon relent.